It was just another regular Tuesday afternoon, the kind where you're tired from a long day of meetings but still have that little spark of excitement because you're heading home. For the woman at the center of this story, it was no different. She was a CEO, a big deal in the tech world, and had just wrapped up an important pitch meeting in New York. Her company was growing fast, and she had spent the entire day talking numbers, strategies, and partnerships with some of the biggest names in business. Now, all she wanted to do was sit back, relax, and maybe catch up on some emails during her flight to San Francisco. She walked onto the plane like any other passenger, dressed sharp as always in her favorite tailored blazer. There was nothing out of the ordinary about her except maybe the quiet confidence she carried. You could tell she was someone who knew how to get things done. She found her seat, stowed her bag, and pulled out her laptop. As the plane filled up around her, she opened a document and started reviewing some notes. It was routine stuff, really. Just another workday spilling into travel time, but then something happened that would change everything, not just for her, but for the airline, its customers, and even the way people thought about racial bias. About 10 minutes after everyone had settled in, 2 airport security officers appeared near her row. They didn't say much at first, just gestured toward her and asked her to step off the plane. At first, she thought there must be some kind of mistake. Maybe they were looking for someone else. But when she tried to explain what she was doing, just working on her laptop, they didn't budge. They insisted she leave right away. Now imagine being in her shoes. You're minding your own business, doing exactly what everyone else is doing on a plane, reading, working, scrolling through your phone, and suddenly you're singled out. Not because you did anything wrong, but because someone decided you looked out of place. That's what happened here. Someone on the plane had flagged her presence, assuming her actions were suspicious simply because of the color of her skin. The whole thing felt surreal. Passengers nearby watched quietly as she argued her case, trying to stay calm despite feeling humiliated. She wasn't loud or aggressive. If anything, she was composed, but inside she was fuming. How could this happen? Why was she being treated like a criminal when all she was doing was sitting in her seat and working? Eventually, the security officers gave her no choice but to comply. So, with a deep breath and clenched fists, she grabbed her belongings and stepped off the plane. Once outside, the full weight of what had just happened hit her. There was no real reason for removing her, no actual threat, no valid explanation. It was clear this wasn't about safety. It was about prejudice. And while she stood there on the jet bridge, staring at the empty plane she'd been kicked off of, she made a decision. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without holding someone accountable. What came next would shock the world. Because this wasn't just any passenger, it was a CEO with resources, connections, and influence. A woman who had built a billion-dollar empire from scratch. Someone who understood the power of standing up for yourself, especially when the odds are stacked against you. What started as a humiliating experience on a random Tuesday afternoon was about to spiral into one of the biggest corporate showdowns anyone had ever seen. After the incident on the plane, the woman didn't waste any time. She was angry, yes, but more than that, she was determined. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. She knew this wasn't an isolated case. Stories like hers happened all the time, but they often went unheard because people were too scared to speak up or didn't have the platform to do so. But she wasn't most people. She had spent years building a reputation as someone who got things done, and now she was ready to put that reputation to work. Once she got home to San Francisco, she sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment as she thought about what to say. Then she started typing. She wrote about how it felt to be singled out on the plane, how it felt to be judged not by her actions but by her appearance. She included photos of herself standing next to the empty aircraft moments after being removed. In the caption, she kept it short and powerful. Asterisk, when your success makes people uncomfortable enough to call security because you're black. Asterisk, she posted it on social media, not really knowing what kind of reaction to expect. At first, there were a few likes and comments from close friends and colleagues. But within hours, something incredible happened. The post blew up. People from all over the world started sharing it, commenting on it, and tagging their friends. Hashtags like #StandWithHer and #StopRacialProfiling began trending. It wasn't long before influencers, activists, and even celebrities joined in, amplifying her voice. The story spread like wildfire, sparking outrage and conversations everywhere. But she wasn't done yet. Posting about it online was just the beginning. As the founder of a multi-billion-dollar tech company, she had serious financial power and she wasn't afraid to use it. A few days later, she held a virtual press conference, sitting in front of a simple backdrop with her company logo behind. She addressed the public directly. Her tone was calm but firm as she explained what had happened and why it mattered. She talked about how racism wasn't just something that happened in personal interactions. It was embedded in systems and institutions, including major corporations like the Airline. Then came the bombshell. She announced that her company would immediately divest all partnerships and investments tied to the airline responsible for her mistreatment. That amounted to a staggering $5 billion in funding. The room went silent as reporters scrambled to process what she had just said. No one had expected her to take such drastic action, but that's exactly what made her move so impactful. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a direct hit to the airline's bottom line. Within minutes of her announcement, the airline's stock prices began to drop. Analysts predicted billions in losses if the situation wasn't resolved quickly. Her decision sent shockwaves through corporate America. Other companies started paying attention, not just because of the money involved, but because of the message it sent. Here was a CEO using her influence to demand accountability. And she wasn't doing it quietly either. She made sure everyone knew why she was taking this stand. In interviews and statements, she emphasized that this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. She wanted the airline to understand the consequences of their actions, or in this case, their inaction. The response from the public was overwhelming. Many people praised her for standing up to a giant corporation and refusing to back down. They saw her as a hero, someone who was willing to risk her own comfort to fight for what was right. Others, however, criticized her methods, calling them extreme or unnecessary. Some argued that pulling $5 billion in funding was too harsh, while others accused her of seeking attention. But none of that seemed to faze her. She knew that change rarely came without resistance, and she was prepared to face whatever pushback came her way. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on the airline continued to mount. Passengers began canceling flights, boycott campaigns gained momentum, and negative headlines dominated the news cycle. Social media played a huge role in keeping the story alive. Every time the airline tried to release a vague apology or deflect responsibility, she was quick to call them out. She challenged them to go beyond empty words and take real action. She demanded transparency, accountability, and measurable steps toward addressing systemic racism within their organization. Behind the scenes, she also started working on something bigger. She reached out to other Black executives and entrepreneurs, inviting them to join forces in creating a coalition aimed at holding corporations accountable for discriminatory practices. Together, they formed what became known as the *Equity First Initiative asterisk. The group pledged to withhold financial support from companies that failed to prioritize diversity and inclusion. Their goal was simple: to create a ripple effect that would force industries across the board to rethink how they treated marginalized communities. By the end of the second week, it was clear that this was no longer just about one woman and one airline. It had grown into a movement, a call to action for businesses everywhere to examine their policies and practices. People were talking about racial profiling in ways they hadn't before. Conversations that had once been brushed aside were now front and center, thanks in large part to her courage and determination. And yet, despite all the chaos and controversy, she remained focused. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that giving up wasn't an option. For her, this wasn't just about getting justice for herself. It was about paving the way for others. It was about showing the world that when you combine resilience with strategy, you can challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression. As the dust began to settle, one thing was certain: she had changed the game. What started as a humiliating encounter on a plane had turned into a global reckoning, one that would leave a lasting impact on the airline industry and beyond. The airline knew it was in trouble, big trouble. After the CEO's announcement about pulling $5 billion in funding, things spiraled out of control faster than anyone could have predicted. Passengers were canceling flights left and right. Social media was ablaze with angry posts calling for boycotts. News outlets couldn't stop talking about the story, and every new headline seemed to dig the airline deeper into a hole. It wasn't just bad press, it was an existential crisis. If they didn't fix this quickly, the company might not survive. At first, the airline tried to play it cool. They issued a generic apology, the kind that sounds like it was written by a PR team trying to cover their tracks. You know the type. We are committed to diversity and inclusion, and we regret any inconvenience caused. But here's the thing: people weren't buying it, not this time. The CEO had laid out the facts so clearly, and her story resonated with so many others who'd experienced similar treatment, that the public wasn't going to let the airline off the hook with vague promises. She saw right through their attempt to smooth things over. In a live stream Q&A session, she called them out directly. With millions watching online, she said, an apology means nothing if it isn't backed by action. Words are cheap. What we need is real change. She went on to explain exactly what real change looked like in her eyes. She wanted the airline to implement anti-bias training, not just a one-hour seminar, but a comprehensive program that would actually make a difference. She demanded more representation of minorities in leadership roles, pointing out that decision-makers at the top were overwhelmingly white and male. And perhaps most importantly, she insisted on transparency. She wanted the airline to track and publicly report incidents of discrimination, holding themselves accountable in a way they never had before. Her demand struck a nerve, not just with the airline but with people everywhere. Other industries started taking notice too. Companies that had long ignored issues of racial bias suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Employees began speaking up, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment. Customers started asking tough questions about how businesses handled discrimination. It was like the floodgates had opened and the CEO's fight became a rallying cry for accountability across the board. Meanwhile, the pressure on the airline kept building. Their stock price plummeted, wiping out billions in value almost overnight. Analysts warned that if the situation wasn't resolved soon, the company could face bankruptcy. Desperate to salvage their reputation, the airline's executives reached out to her privately, hoping to negotiate behind closed doors. They offered settlements, promised reforms, and even hinted at naming a building after her, all in exchange for her silence. But she refused to play along. This wasn't about money or personal glory. It was about justice. She made it clear that any resolution would have to happen publicly, where everyone could see it. Finally, after weeks of dodging responsibility, the airline agreed to meet with her face-to-face. The meeting took place in a sleek corporate boardroom, surrounded by glass walls and polished furniture. On one side of the table sat the airline's top executives, looking nervous and defensive. On the other side sat her, calm and composed, flanked by her legal team and advisors. The tension in the room was palpable. She came prepared. She brought data showing how systemic racism affected not only passengers, but also employees within the airline industry. She presented case studies from other companies that had successfully implemented diversity initiatives. She even shared testimonials from former airline staff who had faced discrimination on the job. Every point she made was backed by evidence, leaving the executives with no room to argue. But it wasn't just her preparation that won the day, it was her conviction. When she spoke, she didn't just talk about numbers or policies. She talked about people. She reminded them that behind every statistic was a human being who had been hurt, humiliated, or excluded because of their race. She told them that this wasn't just about her. It was about all the passengers who had been treated unfairly, all the employees who had been overlooked for promotions, and all the kids watching at home who needed to know that the world could be better. By the end. The meeting, the airline's executives were visibly shaken. For the first time, they seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. They realized that ignoring the problem wasn't an option anymore, not when the cost of doing nothing was so high. Reluctantly, they agreed to her terms. They committed to creating a $100 million fund to support minority-owned businesses impacted by discrimination. They promised to roll out mandatory implicit bias training for all employees, from ground staff to senior management. And they agreed to appoint a chief diversity officer with real power to oversee these changes and ensure accountability. When the details of the agreement were announced during a televised town hall, the reaction was mixed. Some praised her for forcing the airline to take meaningful action. Others criticized her methods, saying she had gone too far. But one thing was undeniable. She had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. People were talking about racial bias in ways they hadn't before. Corporations were rethinking their practices, and passengers were demanding better treatment. For the CEO, though, this was only the beginning. She knew that signing an agreement wasn't enough. Real change would take time, effort, and constant vigilance. She vowed to hold the airline accountable, promising regular updates on their progress. She also expanded her focus, using her platform to advocate for broader reforms in the travel industry and beyond. Her fight had become bigger than one incident or one company. It was about creating a world where everyone could feel safe, respected, and valued, regardless of the color of their skin. As the dust settled, it became clear that this was more than just a victory for her. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, she walked away from the meeting knowing one thing for sure. She had started something that couldn't be stopped. The televised town hall was supposed to be the moment of reckoning for the airline. It was their chance to show the world that they were serious about change, that they understood the depth of the problem, and that they were ready to make things right. But as the cameras rolled and the CEO sat across from the airline's top executives, it was clear this wasn't going to be a simple PR exercise. This was a test of whether the airline could truly own up to its mistakes or if it would try to dodge responsibility one more time. From the start, the atmosphere in the room was tense. The CEO walked in with a calm but steely demeanor, her presence commanding respect. She wasn't there to argue or attack. She was there to hold the airline accountable. On the other side of the table, the airline's executives looked uneasy, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact. They knew they were under the microscope, not just by her, but by millions of viewers watching at home. Every word they said mattered, and they couldn't afford another misstep. The moderator kicked things off by asking the CEO to share her perspective. Without hesitation, she spoke directly to the camera, addressing not just the airline but everyone tuning in. She talked about how it felt to be removed from the plane, not just the humiliation but the deeper sense of being judged based on stereotypes rather than actions. "It's exhausting," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Every time something like this happens, it sends a message: you don't belong here. And when you're Black, those messages come often enough that they start to feel normal. But they shouldn't be normal. They should never be normal." Her words hit hard. People watching at home nodded along, many of them sharing similar stories in the live chat. For so many, this wasn't just about one incident, it was about years of microaggressions, assumptions, and outright discrimination. The CEO had given them a voice, and now that voice was louder than ever. When it was the airline's turn to respond, their initial remarks were hesitant. One executive stumbled over his words, trying to explain why the security team had acted the way they did without sounding defensive. Another attempted to shift the blame onto miscommunication, implying that the whole thing might have been a misunderstanding. But the CEO wasn't having it. With a raised eyebrow and a firm tone, she interrupted. "Let's be clear," she said. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was racial profiling. Calling it anything else is an insult to everyone who has experienced it." The room fell silent. Even the moderators seemed unsure of what to say next. For a moment, it felt like the airline's executives might backpedal entirely. But then, something shifted. Maybe it was the weight of public opinion pressing down on them. Maybe it was the realization that denying the truth would only make things worse. Whatever it was, one of the executives finally spoke up. He admitted that the airline had failed not just in handling her case but in addressing systemic issues within the company. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. Encouraged by this small breakthrough, the CEO pressed forward. She laid out her demands again, this time with even more specificity. She wanted the $100 million fund for minority-owned businesses to be managed by an independent board, ensuring transparency and accountability. She insisted that the anti-bias training go beyond surface-level workshops and include real-world scenarios designed to challenge deeply ingrained prejudices. And she made it clear that the chief diversity officer wouldn't just be a figurehead. They would have veto power over hiring decisions, marketing campaigns, and policy changes. Airlines executives listened intently, nodding along as she spoke. By the end of the discussion, they agreed to all of her terms. They even went a step further, promising to conduct annual audits of their practices and publish the results publicly. It was a monumental commitment, one that would require significant resources and effort. But for the first time, it felt like they were taking real ownership of the problem. After the town hall ended, reactions poured in from every corner of the globe. Many praised the CEO for standing her ground and refusing to settle for half measures. Others applauded the airline for finally stepping up and acknowledging their shortcomings. Of course, there were still skeptics, people who doubted whether the airline would follow through on its promises or if this was just another PR stunt. But even the skeptics had to admit that something extraordinary had happened. A single person had taken on a massive corporation and forced it to confront its flaws in front of the entire world. For the CEO, though, the work was far from over. She knew that signing agreements and making promises was only the beginning. Real change would take time, persistence, and constant pressure. That's why she announced plans to monitor the airline's progress closely. She vowed to release quarterly updates, highlighting both successes and areas where improvement was needed. If the airline slipped up, she made it clear she wouldn't hesitate to call them out and pull her funding if necessary. But she didn't stop there. Inspired by the momentum of the movement, she expanded her efforts beyond the airline industry. She partnered with advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and grassroots activists to create a broader coalition aimed at tackling racial bias in all forms of transportation. Together, they launched campaigns to educate travelers, train employees, and push for legislative changes that would protect passengers from discrimination. Her goal was simple yet ambitious: to transform the way people thought about equity and inclusion in public spaces. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of her actions became undeniable. Other airlines began revising their policies, implementing stricter guidelines for handling complaints of racial profiling. Hotels, ride-sharing services, and even retail chains started paying closer attention to how they treated customers of color. Employees in these industries found courage to speak up about injustices they had witnessed or experienced themselves. Slowly but surely, a cultural shift was taking place, one driven largely by the CEO's unwavering determination. Yet despite all the progress, she remained humble. In interviews, she often reminded people that this wasn't about her. "I'm just one person," she would say. "What matters is the collective effort, the voices of millions demanding better. Change doesn't happen because of one individual. It happens when we all stand together." Her humility resonated with people. She wasn't seeking fame or fortune. She was fighting for fairness. And in doing so, she inspired countless others to join the cause. From students organizing protests to CEOs reevaluating their company cultures, her story sparked a ripple effect that reached far beyond what anyone could have imagined. By the time the dust settled, it was clear that this was more than just a victory against one airline. It was a turning point, a moment when society collectively said, "Enough is enough." The road ahead would undoubtedly be long and difficult, but thanks to her courage and leadership, the journey toward true equality had gained unstoppable momentum. Months had passed since the televised town hall, and while the dust seemed to have settled on the surface, the ripple effects of what the CEO had started continued to spread. The airline was working hard to keep its promises, or at least that's what they claimed in their glossy reports and polished press releases. But for her, this wasn't about ticking boxes or meeting quotas. It was about creating lasting change, and she wasn't about to let anyone off the hook until she saw real results. True to her word, she kept a close eye on the airline's progress. Every 3 months, she published detailed updates online, breaking down where the company was succeeding and where it still fell short. Her reports were brutally honest, not just praising improvements, but also calling out areas that needed more work. For example, when the airline announced the launch of its anti-bias training program, she pointed out that some employees had described it as too basic and not impactful enough. She pushed them to revamp the curriculum, incorporating feedback from experts and participants alike. When the $100 million fund for minority-owned businesses struggled to distribute funds efficiently, she stepped in personally, connecting the airline with organizations that could help streamline the process. Her relentless oversight earned her both admiration and criticism. Some praised her for staying involved and holding the airline accountable, while others accused her of being overly harsh or nitpicky. But she didn't care about the backlash. What mattered to her was making sure the changes stuck, that they weren't just temporary fixes designed to quiet critics, but actual, sustainable improvements that would benefit future generations. Beyond the airline, her influence continued to grow. The coalition she had formed, the one aimed at tackling racial bias across industries, had blossomed into a powerful force. Hundreds of companies joined the initiative, pledging to adopt stricter anti-discrimination policies and invest in diversity programs. Employees who once felt powerless to speak up now had a platform to share their stories and demand better treatment. Customers, too, became more vocal, using social media to call out businesses that failed to live up to their promises. Slowly, but surely, accountability was becoming the norm rather than the exception. One of the most surprising outcomes of her campaign was the way it inspired everyday people to take action in their own lives. Teachers began teaching lessons on racial equity in classrooms. Parents started having tough conversations with their kids about prejudice and fairness. Even small business owners got involved, hosting workshops and events to promote inclusivity within their communities. The movement wasn't confined to boardrooms or corporate offices. It had trickled down to neighborhoods, schools, and homes, sparking meaningful discussions everywhere it went. For the CEO herself, life had changed dramatically. She was no longer just a tech entrepreneur. She was a symbol of resilience and justice. People looked to her not only for leadership but also for hope. Strangers approached her on the street to thank her for standing up when so many others stayed silent. Messages poured in from around the world, sharing stories of how her actions had inspired courage in those who felt voiceless. It was overwhelming at times, but it also fueled her determination to keep going. Despite her newfound fame, she remained grounded. She often reminded people that she wasn't perfect, that she too had made mistakes along the way. In interviews, she spoke openly about moments when she doubted herself, when the weight of responsibility felt almost unbearable. "I'm human," she said during one particularly candid conversation. "I get tired. I feel frustrated. There are days when I wonder if all of this is worth it. But then I think about everyone counting on me, and I remember why I started this fight in the first place." Her vulnerability resonated deeply with people. They saw her not as an untouchable figurehead, but as someone relatable, someone who understood the struggles of fighting for what's right in a world that often resists change. That authenticity made her even more effective as a leader because it reminded people that they didn't have to be perfect to make a difference. All they needed was courage and conviction. As time went on, she decided to channel her experiences into something more permanent, a memoir titled *Boarding While Black*. The book chronicled her journey from being removed from the plane to becoming a global advocate for racial justice. It wasn't just a retelling of events. It was a reflection on identity, resilience, and the power of standing up for yourself. Chapters alternated between raw emotion and practical advice, offering readers insight into how they could navigate similar challenges in their own lives. When it hit shelves, it quickly climbed bestseller lists, further solidifying her status as a thought leader and changemaker. But perhaps the most profound impact of her story was the way it reshaped conversations about race and privilege. Before her ordeal, many people dismissed incidents of racial profiling as isolated cases or brushed them aside as unfortunate but unavoidable. Now, thanks to her advocacy, those same people were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic racism and unconscious bias. Companies that had long ignored these issues suddenly found themselves scrambling to address them. Lawmakers introduced new legislation aimed at protecting passengers from discrimination. Even airlines outside the United States began revising their policies, inspired by the changes happening stateside. Through it all, the CEO never lost sight of her original mission: to ensure that no one else had to endure what she had gone through. She knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she also knew that progress was possible. By combining strategic action with unyielding justice, she had proven that individuals could challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Looking back, she sometimes marveled at how far she'd come. From that humiliating moment on the plane to becoming a driving force behind a global movement, her journey was nothing short of extraordinary. Yet despite all the accolades and achievements, she remained focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't about her legacy. It was about creating a world where everyone could thrive, regardless of the color of their skin. And so, as she sat at her desk late one evening, drafting plans for her next big project, she smiled to herself. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but she was ready. After all, she had already shown the world what was possible when you refused to stay silent, and that lesson would continue to inspire others for years to come.